I'm nervous for this. The lactic acid, it's in my legs. How am I going to recover? Look, I get it. Lactic acid has been demonized for years. It's been drilled into your psyche that lactic acid is the problem to your conditioning and the reason why you're fatiguing. It gets blamed for everything, but it seems a bit unfair, especially when we look at the research around lactic acid and lactate and the beneficial effects that lactate provides us as combat athletes when it comes to our conditioning and being able to last for a fight. So this is a myth-busting video. The reason why lactic acid is not the demon that it is made to be, and it's actually a helpful substance that can enhance your conditioning, and there's a way to do conditioning to help you use this fuel more readily and be able to repeat high intensity efforts and not gas out in a fight. If you haven't already picked it up, go down the description. There's the free MMA strength and conditioning blueprint. A lot of the stuff isn't in there, but I'm going to be updating that soon. So it's free. If you get that now, I will be sending out an updated version in the near future with a lot of this conditioning information. But I think the best place to start with this, I've got my laptop here just so I've got some notes on this because I can't remember all of it off the top of my head, is just defining what lactic acid is. And within the body, lactic acid virtually doesn't exist. Instead, it's lactate ion and a hydrogen ion. These two are typically synonymous together. Lactate is associated with these hydrogen ions. I'll go into that in a bit in some detail soon. But let's start with how lactate increases. I'm sure you've seen the graph. I'm gonna pop one up here, which shows the lactate curve steady down the bottom and then shooting up. And then we see these little markers, things like aerobic threshold, anaerobic threshold, or lactic threshold, things you've probably heard before and have been touted as the conditioning gospel when it comes to improving your fitness. That's shifting these thresholds further to the right so you can stay less quote unquote lactic throughout your fights. But I will dive into that a bit later too. So let's go into how lactate increases. So first we have ATP. We've talked about this a bit. Essentially the muscle's energy source, adenosine triphosphate, through the glycolytic pathway, which would be considered an anaerobic pathway, which uses muscle glycogen, blood glucose, essentially sugars and carbohydrates for fuel. It creates ATP from pyruvate, and it also creates a hydrogen ion. This pyruvate is then shuttled into the mitochondria. We've talked about mitochondria a lot too. Essentially the aerobic powerhouse uses oxygen to create energy, and it takes this pyruvate to create this energy with oxygen. Now, the old way of thinking is around these aerobic and anaerobic thresholds, which I mentioned just earlier, and this is where this kind of all ties in. The aerobic threshold is considered kind of the first inflection point of when blood lactate rises slightly, typically around 2 to 4 millimoles per liter around. It's better termed onset of blood lactate because that's when we see that first little rise. As exercise intensity increases, the mitochondria can't keep up with all this excess pyruvate that is being created, and it cannot be metabolized in the mitochondria, so we have this excess going on outside, and that is converted into lactate, and that lactate is with those hydrogen ions. And this is where we start to get into the concepts that are typically talked about within conditioning, and that is we're now building up all this lactate and hydrogen ions. It means we are now quote unquote anaerobic. Now, multiple factors may contribute to this increase in blood lactate. Things like oxygen delivery, we've talked about this within central limiting factors, mitochondrial capacity, which would be our peripherally limiting factors, the ability to clear and use lactate by other cells throughout the body, which I'll go into as well in a second. And there's a really good paper. If you're interested more in diving a little deeper into this as well, check out Lactic Acid Friend or Foe in 2016. It's a good paper. But essentially then we have the lactic threshold or anaerobic threshold. It's when lactate starts to skyrocket. And you'll see that on the graph as well, which I'll have up here. But it should probably be coined maximal lactate steady state. And it's essentially the maximum intensity you can hold where lactate doesn't increase by more than 1 millimole. Now, it is thought that once we go past this threshold, we go from aerobic to anaerobic metabolism, essentially like a switch. When our lactate's low below this threshold, hey, we're operating in the aerobic environment. We're able to recover easily. It's a sub-maximal effort. We're not gonna gas out. Then once we pass this threshold, it's doomsday. Now we're going to fatigue. Now we're tapping into finite anaerobic energy stores, which yes, they are finite in terms of muscle glycogen and etc. But there's more to it. We're tapping into these finite energy stores and we're going to gas out if we stay here. And if we spend too much time there, we're not going to be able to recover between rounds, between efforts, etc. However, we know that we can't isolate energy systems. We know that energy systems don't work in isolation. We know that 30-second sprints have a very high aerobic component. We see that muscles use a lot of oxygen in those from muscle oxygenation data, which means that no true effort is purely anaerobic or without oxygen. Now, this brings us to one of the theories around fatigue, and that is the presence and the rise of lactate is associated with the rise in hydrogen ions, which are acidic ions, linking the lactic acid hypothesis with fatigue. Now, I'm not going to go fully into a fatigue episode here. We don't know exactly what causes fatigue. It's likely multifactorial. There are a lot of moving pieces within this, but to say that lactic acid and the acidic environment causes fatigue or leads to fatigue is likely not true. And I know I've made this mistake in the past talking about this way, and I'm trying to bring you some updated information. But essentially, one of the theories is we see this increase in blood lactate. Associated with lactate are these hydrogen ions. So we see an increase in acidic metabolites from metabolism. This acidic environment then reduces the contractile ability of the muscle because of the lower pH. If you remember chemistry class, pH, the scale 7 is neutral, below 7 is acidic, above 7 is alkaline or basic. Essentially, we're creating a more acidic environment in the muscle, and that is hindering muscle contractile properties. However, there's some major problems with this theory. The first one is a lot of the research done in this area is from imposed anaerobic environments. So essentially, you're taking muscle, they're gassing it with nitrogen instead of oxygen, or they're using an ischemic cuff. So remember blood flow restriction training when you're cutting off the blood flow to a muscle, or they're doing it in very cold temperatures, animal muscles, all sorts of stuff going on there that potentially doesn't translate to the human body at normal temperatures under normal physiological conditions. What's interesting is we don't actually see acidosis causing fatigue. So there's increase in hydrogen ions at normal temperature. And there's a great study by Patty and his colleagues in 1995. Essentially, they tested muscle at 10 degrees Celsius and 30 degrees Celsius. And they showed that at 10 degrees Celsius, yes, we see acidosis reduces maximum velocity and force within the muscle. At 30 degrees, there's minimal effect of reducing pH or increasing acidosis, and it indicates that it plays less of an important role in fatigue. We can go into another example by Nielsen and his colleagues in 2001. They took skeletal rat muscle, and essentially they threw twitches at it, electrical pulses into the muscle, and they were twitching the muscle essentially to contract. This wasn't a live rat, by the way, just this was a skin muscle. And essentially they see a reduction in force because of the buildup in potassium concentration in the muscle. But when they added lactic acid to this muscle, they see a huge recovery in force generation, and that indicates that lactic acid counteracts the force depressing effects of this buildup in potassium. I have the graph up here too. Essentially, they either just added the potassium, 11 millimoles into it, had the muscle contract, they added potassium plus lactic acid, or they added potassium and then lactic acid 90 minutes later. And you can see from the different lines there that when no lactic acid was added, you see that force depression and it stays. When there's lactic acid, you see that huge recovery in force generation, which then doesn't make sense if you're going by the acidosis or lactic acid hypothesis of fatigue, because if we're adding an acidic environment, surely then we would have issues with contractile function, which we don't see in this study. So then the question becomes, what actually happens with this lactate? We're building up all this lactate. If it's not causing fatigue and the acidic environment isn't causing us problems, what is actually happening? There's a great paper by Simon Cairns in 2006 out of AUT University in Auckland, New Zealand. I have to give a shout out. My old university there had quite a few researchers on the podcast, and I'll be bringing more on soon. But essentially, the question becomes, is lactate ergogenic? As in, is it performance enhancing? Turns out it probably is. Lactate is actually fuel. So there's the lactate shuttle theory. I do not have the original author or paper up who came up with this, but if you search it, I'm sure you'll find it. But essentially, lactate is shuttled into an oxidated fiber, which would be our type 1 slow twitch fibers, where it can be metabolized into pyruvate. We talked about pyruvate before, and then it is metabolized in the mitochondria to create more energy. So essentially doing almost like a reverse, almost like a reverse transition there. Now, it's important to note that lactate isn't just made into pyruvate and then in the mitochondria and then uses energy for muscles. It's actually a preferred energy source for the brain, the heart, the liver, the kidneys, all of these organs during training, and especially within the liver and kidneys, because it helps create more glucose from the glycogen stored in your liver, and that's what lactate helps to essentially bring out to be used as more fuel. And as the intensity of exercise increases, lactate becomes the preferred energy source for the brain and muscles because it's fast and efficient. Now, I've taken that little part from Dr. John Babry's high intensity training book, hopefully be republishing that on the website at some point, but you can pick that up on Amazon too. It's a damn good book. It was written a little over 10 years ago. A lot of stuff in there that can help you with your combat sports conditioning. And I'll be referencing a lot of stuff in that book too near the end. But this brings us back to the idea of the aerobic and anaerobic threshold. How most people explain, or how most people's philosophies run around conditioning for intermittent sports sports where you have to repeat high intensity efforts like most combat sports, is to keep lactate as low as possible for as long as possible. And I mentioned at the beginning around most people try and create conditioning where you want to stay in as low lactate environment as possible. We want to delay when you go quote unquote anaerobic. We know that's not the case. We know that's physiologically impossible, but that's the general premise around most conditioning modalities. And they want to increase the power or increase the heart rate in which this tipping point occurs, so you don't get this associated rise in the acidic environment too early. For example, people might see an anaerobic threshold at 160 beats per minute and they're trying to move it to 170 beats per minute, or 300 watts and they want to move it to 350 watts, stating that, okay, we can now operate at higher intensities in lower lactate environments or under aerobic metabolism. That's why there's a big push in zone 2 conditioning in a lot of combat sports, or actually in a lot of sports really, to use more fats as fuel to reduce the glycolytic rate, which is reducing our anaerobic input, and then lowering blood lactate. But the question becomes then, does this even matter for performance? A lot of the zone 2 talk is longevity influencers, podcasters, etc., talking about being metabolically flexible or just general health. Yes, being generally healthy is good, but we're trying to maximize conditioning for combat sports. Turns out this probably doesn't really matter that much. If we look at lactic threshold or maximal lactate steady state or anaerobic threshold, all kind of interchangeable terms, but for physiological correctness, maximal lactate steady state is probably a better term. It does not predict relative power output, so power output relative to body weight, which this paper terms workload or performance time. And this is by Benecke and his colleagues in the year 2000. Essentially, they state that two athletes could have identical maximal lactate steady states, so identical anaerobic thresholds, but different power outputs relative to body weight and have different times to exhaustion when they're going just above that. The authors concluded that the speculations of high performance, essentially in lower blood lactate environments, so having a high anaerobic threshold, and increasing workload intensity could not be verified. So in other words, maximal lactate steady state can give us an indication of how intense an exercise is, but it cannot tell us the individual's performance at that threshold, and it cannot tell us how long this athlete can work there. And there's a really, really good quote from that lactate friend or foe paper I referenced near the beginning by Hall and his colleagues in 2016, and they say that performance predicts performance. And what they mean is here, I'll take a quote straight from the paper. In a study of elite endurance athletes, maximal sustainable speed on a treadmill predicted 5K running performance better than VO2 max, running economy, VO2 at lactate threshold, onset of blood lactate, or maximal lactate steady state. Basically saying that you can have all these physiological measures, but what's most important is performance. So a really good example of this, if say you're doing any kind of bike sprints, or you're doing any kind of, even just running, timing that run or tracking power output during those sprints on the bike or air bike is gonna have a better predictor on your performance than looking at all these different physiological variables. It doesn't make these physiological variables useless, because a lot of the times we want to program based on physiology to improve these outputs that you're seeing on the screen in front of you with power outputs, which is kind of the interplay between pure outputs and the physiological side that underpins them. Now I'm gonna read this section from Dr. John Babry's book. Again, you should listen to him on the Sweet Science Fighting podcast as well, on the podcast channel. There's a couple of podcasts with them there, but essentially lactate is also not just an important source of energy during maximal high intensity exercise, but also when working at lower intensities or when recovering from higher intensity exercise. So again, lactate is always being produced. Even when you're sitting here watching this video, you are producing lactate and using it as fuel. You're just not producing as much lactate as you would if you're doing more intense exercise. This makes it essential for getting the most out of high intensity training, as you will need to use it to fuel your sprints and to increase the speed of your recovery. The reason people who do more physical activity can perform longer and harder is not because they're able to withstand lactic acid or that their bodies produce less lactate. And we talked about this regarding this anaerobic threshold. Just because you're operating under this threshold and producing less lactate does not mean that you suddenly perform longer or harder. What happens is that as you train, your muscles adapt to be able to more readily use this fuel source. The strenuous efforts causes a greater production of lactic acid or lactate, and this combined with small rest periods, so we're talking specifically of sprint intervals here, that do not quite give your body enough time to replenish other fuel sources, forces your body to more efficiently use alternative sources of energy, i.e. lactate. So then how are we improving these qualities to be able to use lactate as fuel? Typically, it comes down to these sprint intervals. And we ran through some guidelines on that podcast with Dr. John Babry, but I'm gonna give them to you here. Essentially, you're doing 6 to 30 second work efforts. You want to total 1 to 2, potentially to 3, but mainly between 1 to 2 minutes of total work time. And you want around a 1 to 2 to 1 to 8 work to rest ratio. And your rest should have you feeling like you're not quite fully recovered, but you're not absolutely dead before the next interval. So there's a fine line. You're gonna have to play around with that, and then you can shorten or increase the rest intervals based on that. And then you're doing around twice a week. This is how we're improving peripheral adaptations around the muscle being able to use oxygen well. We're improving the ability to use lactate as fuel. Plus we're getting some central adaptations in the beginning to this by improving VO2 max through central mechanisms. Now, does this mean that you only do sprint intervals all the time? No, not all the time, but you can use this very often. I believe you can use this more than what we originally thought around having to have so much low intensity work than only doing a few weeks of high intensity training. I think we can do more high intensity training more often, but we should still potentially try to target some form of central adaptation, maybe through longer high intensity intervals, etc., but not all the time. But there is definitely a lack of really high intensity training and a lot of people's training programs that likely need to be there. Super maximal work, as hard as you can, should be a part of some of your training to reap some of these benefits. Now, if you have any further questions, you want me to cover anything else, please let me know down in the comments. Also, make sure you download that MMA strength conditioning blueprint. I will have more for jiu-jitsu, boxing, etc., and all those martial arts as well eventually. I'm just going to update this MMA one first with some new conditioning information, but I'll see you in the next video.